The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Bellevue and Sons Funeral Home like fists begging to be let in. The storm had rolled in just after midnight, cutting the power and leaving only the dim glow of emergency lanterns to push back. The darkness. Jacob Riley, the newest apprentice, wiped his sweaty palms on his suit pants as he checked the locks on the front doors. He wasn't supposed to be alone tonight, but Old Man Bellevue had left hours ago, muttering about bad signs and the wrong kind of quiet. Jacob wasn't superstitious. At least that's what he told himself when he took the job. Funeral homes didn't scare him. Death was just a business, bodies just clients. But Bellevue wasn't like other funeral homes. The whispers in town warned about it. The way the air inside always smelled faintly of wet soil, even in winter. The way the portraits of past directors seemed to watch you a second too long. He adjusted his tie and turned toward the embalming room to finish prepping Mrs. Henderson for her morning viewing. That's when he heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not from the front door, not from the basement. From down the hall, the one with the velvet curtains. Jacob's breath hitched. He knew the rule. Never go near room 9. Bellevue had drilled it into him on his first day. "If you hear anything from that room," the old man had said, his yellowed eyes unblinking, "you run. You don't ask why. You don't look back." But the knocks came again. Louder. And then a scratch. Like nails dragging down wood. Jacob's feet moved before his brain could stop them. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the lantern light shrinking behind him. The velvet. Curtains swayed, though there was no draft. His fingers trembled as he reached for the fabric, pushing it aside. The door to room 9 was slightly open. A cold, rotting smell slithered out, and inside, something breathed. The moment Jacob's fingers brushed the door, a wave of icy air rushed over him, carrying the scent of damp earth and something older, something wrong. The room beyond was pitch black, but he could feel the space inside was larger than it should have been, as if the walls had stretched back into endless dark. His lantern flickered, casting jagged shadows that twisted along the floor like crawling fingers. He wanted to run, to bolt back down the hall and never return, but his body refused to obey. His legs carried him forward, one step, then another, until the door groaned shut behind him with a sound like a coffin lid sealing. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It was the silence of a grave. No hum of electricity, no whisper of wind, just the thick, suffocating quiet of a place where sound went to die. Then, from the far corner, a wet, ragged inhale. Jacob's blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. His lantern's trembling light skimmed over the walls, revealing rows of framed photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. But these weren't portraits of grieving families or proud funeral directors. Each one showed a corpse. Some were bloated, their skin split from decay. Others were skeletal, grinning with hollow sockets. Every photo was labeled in neat looping. Script, missing, unclaimed, forgotten. And then he saw her. At the center of the room, on a rusted gurney, lay a woman in a tattered black dress, her skin gray and sunken. Her lips had been sewn shut with thick black thread, the stitches pulling her mouth into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Her fingers were bent like claws, the nails broken and caked with dirt, as if she had dug her way out of the earth. Jacob's breath came in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't just a body. This was someone who had been buried alive. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, her eyes snapped open. They weren't milky with death. They weren't glassy or unfocused. They were aware, and they locked onto his. Jacob's scream lodged in his throat like a fistful of broken glass. He couldn't make a sound, couldn't move, couldn't even blink as those horrible, living eyes stared into him, peeling back layers of his soul like skin from a corpse. The woman on the gurney didn't sit up, didn't twitch, didn't so much as breathe, but her fingers flexed, the joints cracking like dry branches, and the gurney's wheels let out a rusty squeal as it shifted an inch toward him. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on Jacob's chest until his ribs ached, until his heartbeat pounded in his ears like a funeral drum. He wanted to believe this was a nightmare, some sick hallucination from exhaustion, but the smell, God, the smell was undeniable. The sweet rot stench of turned earth and spoiled meat, the copper tang of old blood, the sour musk of sweat and terror. This was real. This was happening. And then the whispers started, not from the woman, not from any one place at all. They came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the photographs themselves, a chorus of voices murmuring in languages Jacob didn't recognize, words that slithered into his ears and coiled around his brain like parasites. Some sounded pleading, others furious, a few almost hungry. The lantern in his hand sputtered, the light shrinking to a feeble glow, and in the dimming haze he saw them, shapes, moving in the photographs. Fingers pressing against the glass from the inside, lips mouthing silent screams, eyes blinking. The woman's head tilted toward him, her neck tendons snapping audibly, and for the first time, Jacob found his voice. He screamed, not a human sound, but something raw and animal, ripped from the deepest, most primal part of him. He stumbled back, crashing into the door, his fingers scrambling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, or something was holding it shut. Behind him, the gurney's wheels screeched again, closer this time. The moment Jacob's back hit the door, he realized with a jolt of pure, mindless terror that the room itself was alive. Not just the woman on the gurney, not just the things trapped in the photographs, but the walls, the floor, even the air, thick and syrupy with something far worse than decay. The whispers swelled into a cacophony of overlapping voices, some sobbing, some laughing, others chanting in guttural, broken syllables that made his skull vibrate, as if the very sound could unravel his sanity. The lantern's light guttered, like a dying heartbeat, throwing jagged shadows that slithered across the floor like serpents, and in that flickering half-darkness he saw the woman's fingers. Twitch again, her nails, blackened and cracked, scraping against the gurneys. Metal with a sound like bones dragged over gravel. Her stitched lips trembled, the threads straining as if something behind them was pushing, fighting to get out, and the wet, muffled groans that escaped her sealed mouth sent hot urine trickling down Jacob's leg, his bladder betraying him in sheer animal panic. He clawed at the door, his nails splintering against the wood, his throat raw from screaming, but the handle wouldn't turn. The door wouldn't budge, and the gurney kept creaking. Closer, inch by inch, until he could see the fine details of her rotting dress, the way the fabric clung to her sunken ribs, the dark stains where her body had leaked into the cloth. The photographs around him rattled in their frames, the glass cracking as the things inside pressed harder, their mouths open in silent howls, their hands splayed against the barriers that kept them trapped. And then, worse than anything, the woman's eyes rolled back, the pupils vanishing into her skull, leaving only milky white orbs that somehow still saw him, still knew him, as her head lolled to the side and her stitched mouth stretched into a grotesque, impossible grin, the threads snapping one by one with tiny, wet pops. The last thing Jacob saw before the lantern died completely was her lips parting. Not to speak, not to scream, but to inhale, deep and slow, as if she were drinking in his terror like wine. Then the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness that swallowed Jacob was not the absence of light. It was a living thing, a suffocating entity that coiled around him like a serpent, its weight pressing into his lungs until each breath came in ragged, desperate gasps that did nothing to ease the fire in his chest. He could feel the woman's presence even though he could no longer see her, her ragged exhales brushing against his face like the touch of damp cobwebs, her fingers, cold and stiff as graveyard dirt, skimming his throat as if deciding where to grip hardest. The whispers in the room had merged into a single, droning hum, a sound that vibrated in his teeth and made his vision blur at the edges, as though his very consciousness was being unraveled thread by thread. Somewhere in the blackness, the gurney groaned again, its wheels rolling slowly, deliberately, and Jacob knew, with a certainty that turned his bones to ice, that it was now right in front of him. The stench of her, moldering fabric, spoiled meat, and something sweetly chemical, like embalming fluid left to fester, filled his nose, his mouth, his pores, until he could taste her decay on his tongue. Then, a new sound. A rip. The woman's. Stitches had fully torn. Her mouth opened, and what came out was not a scream, not a word, but a voice. Not hers, but dozens, hundreds, a chorus of the dead speaking through her ruined throat in a language that was never meant for human ears. The force of it hit Jacob like a physical blow, sending him crashing to his knees, his hands flying up to cover his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. It was inside him now, slithering through his veins, carving its way into his mind with jagged, unrelenting clarity. The photographs on the walls shattered simultaneously, glass exploding outward in a glittering storm, and from the frames, things began to crawl. Not just the corpses from the pictures, but twisted, malformed versions of them. Their limbs, too long, their mouths too wide, their movements all wrong, like puppets jerked by unseen strings. They dragged themselves free of their glass prisons, their hollow eyes fixed on Jacob, their skeletal fingers clicking against the floor as they advanced. The woman on the gurney sat up, her spine cracking audibly, her head lolling to the side at an unnatural angle, her gaping mouth still pouring forth that terrible, echoing chorus of voices. One of her hands, brittle, yellowed bone barely held, together by desiccated flesh, reached for him, and as her fingers closed around his wrist, Jacob felt something break inside him. Not just his sanity, but something deeper, something fundamental to being human. The last thing he heard before his mind finally shattered was the woman's voice. Just hers now, soft and rotting and intimate, whispering directly into his ear. "You'll look so lovely in a frame." The moment the woman's corpse-like fingers tightened around Jacob's wrist, a surge of images flooded his mind. Not memories, but someone else's memories. The final moments of countless victims who had stood exactly where he now stood. There, terror imprinted in the very walls of Room 9 like psychic scars that now tore through his consciousness with brutal clarity. A mortician in 1963 clutching his chest as his heart stopped mid-scream, a curious police officer in 1978 whose skin turned inside out as he touched the gurney, a teenage trespasser in 1992 whose eyes liquefied as the whispers grew louder. Each death more gruesome than the last, each soul adding to the chorus of trapped voices that now reverberated through Jacob's shuddering body as the woman's grip became vice-like, her yellowed fingernails sinking into his flesh as though marking him as hers. The pain somehow cutting through the haze of panic to remind him with startling clarity that he was still alive. For now, though the things crawling from the broken, photographs were closing in, their elongated limbs moving with insectile precision, their gaping mouths revealing rows of needle-like teeth that glistened with some unnameable fluid in what little light remained, their hollow eye sockets somehow conveying a dreadful hunger that made Jacob's legs give out completely, sending him collapsing to the floor, which felt disturbingly warm and yielding beneath him, like fresh-turned earth in an open grave, and as he struggled to push himself up, his hands sank slightly into the floorboards which had taken on the consistency of rotted flesh, the wood grain now resembling stretched human skin, complete with visible veins that pulsed faintly beneath his fingertips. The entire room breathing in unison with the woman's ragged gasps as she leaned closer, her torn lips brushing against his ear as she inhaled his scent like a connoisseur sampling fine wine, her breath carrying the unmistakable stench of an exhumed casket. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, taking on the timbre of Old Man Bellevue himself, the words slithering into Jacob's ear with dreadful intimacy. "You should have listened, boy. But don't worry, you'll make a fine addition to our collection, just like all the others who couldn't resist Room 9's call." And as the words faded, the photographs on the walls began to rattle violently, their broken glass shards levitating in the air like some macabre constellation before suddenly reversing direction and shooting toward Jacob with terrifying speed, each piece carrying with it a fleeting image of the face that would soon join the gallery of the damned. The air in Room 9 had become a suffocating miasma of decay and something far more ancient, a primordial wrongness that seeped into Jacob's pores like a physical violation as the floating shards of glass hovered around him in a cruel mockery of suspended time, each fragment reflecting not his own terrified face but the twisted visages of those who had come before him. The funeral director from 63 with his mouth sewn shut in a permanent scream, the police officer's skin stretched taut over bones that were no longer human, the teenager's hollowed-out eye sockets weeping black ichor, and as the woman's grip on his wrist tightened to the point where he could feel his bones grinding together, Jacob realized with dawning horror that the room wasn't just showing him these images. It was offering him a choice of how he would join them, the glass shards rotating slowly to present different grotesque possibilities like some hellish catalogue of damnation, each more terrible than the last, while beneath him the floor had fully transformed into something organic, pulsing with a sickening rhythm that matched the woman's labored breathing. Tendrils of blackened flesh rising up to coil around his ankles with the possessive intimacy of a lover's embrace, their surface studded with tiny, blinking eyes that wept tears of congealed blood as they drank in his terror. The walls, meanwhile, had begun to peel open like rotten fruit, revealing layers of compressed photographs behind the plaster. Not framed portraits, but thousands of Polaroids crammed together in a honeycomb of suffering, each showing a different victim at their moment of transformation, their faces frozen, in expressions of perfect agony as their bodies twisted into impossible shapes, their mouths open in silent screams that Jacob could suddenly hear ringing inside his skull with deafening clarity, a symphony of torment that made his nose bleed and his vision swim with black spots. And through it all, the woman kept whispering, her voice now splitting into dozens of overlapping tones as the spirits in the room spoke through her, their words slithering into his ears like physical things that squirmed and burrowed into his brain, each syllable a razor cutting away another piece of his sanity, while the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath came in visible plumes that the woman hungrily inhaled, her chest expanding with each stolen exhalation as though she were drawing his very life force from his lungs. And when she smiled this time, Jacob saw that her teeth were no longer human but elongated and needle-thin, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled down her gullet into impossible darkness, and he knew with absolute certainty that when those teeth closed around him, he wouldn't die, not truly, but would instead join the chorus of voices in this eternal nightmare. Another photograph on the wall, another warning for the next curious soul who dared to turn the key in Room 9's rusted lock. Jacob's body had become a battleground between the living world he was desperately clinging to and the unspeakable horror that was slowly claiming him. His skin prickled with an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, as though thousands of invisible insects were crawling just beneath the surface, their spindly legs carving sigils of dread into his flesh with every movement, while his heartbeat had become erratic, skipping every third beat as if something inside his chest was rearranging his organs to make space for whatever corruption was taking root within him, and when he tried to scream, the sound died in his throat, strangled by an unseen force that slithered down his windpipe like a serpent made of smoke, coiling tight around his vocal cords in a grip that promised he would never make another sound again. The woman, if she could still be called that, had begun to change, her skeletal frame twisting and elongating in ways that defied anatomy, her spine curving like a question mark as her limbs stretched to impossible lengths, fingers branching into twig-like appendages that clicked together in a rhythm that mimicked the sound of bones breaking in reverse, her face collapsing inward only to reform with new, more terrible features, a mouth that split vertically, a nose that melted away to reveal twin holes that pulsed wetly, eyes that multiplied and scattered across her forehead like a constellation of suffering, and with each transformation the room responded in kind, the walls bleeding a thick black fluid that smelled of gangrenous wounds and spoiled embalming chemicals, the liquid forming into grasping hands that reached for Jacob, with disturbing sentience, their fingers brushing against his face with the cold, slick touch of a corpse pulled from a winter river. The photographs embedded in the walls had begun to vibrate violently, their edges curling like leaves in a fire as the faces within strained against their paper prisons, mouths opening in unison to release a soundless wail that Jacob felt rather than heard, a pressure building in his skull that made his teeth ache and his eyes feel ready to burst from their sockets. And then, worst of all, he realized the hands emerging from the walls weren't just random manifestations, but exact replicas of his own hands, down to the scar on his left thumb from a childhood accident. And as this revelation struck him, the woman's many mouths spread into identical grotesque smiles. Her heads, for she had grown several now, each more malformed than the last, tilting in perfect synchronization as she spoke in a voice that was an exact mimicry of Jacob's own, but distorted, as if played backward through a broken tape recorder. "We've been waiting for you for so long, Jacob. Or should I say, me?" The moment these words registered, a new horror dawned. The room wasn't just showing him his fate, it was revealing the terrible truth that there had never been a Jacob Riley, that he was simply the latest in an endless cycle of victims who all believed themselves to be someone new, when in reality they were all the same poor soul trapped in an eternal recurrence of terror, doomed to experience this moment again and again for all eternity, each iteration believing themselves to be the first, each scream perfectly preserved, in the walls of room 9 like a fly in amber, forever fresh, forever raw, forever alive in their suffering. The revelation crashed over Jacob like a tidal wave of pure madness, each wave of understanding dragging him deeper into an abyss where time, identity, and sanity unraveled like the frayed edges of a burial shroud. His hands, now trembling violently before him, were no longer entirely his own, the fingers elongating and warping in slow, grotesque increments, the nails darkening to the same blackened hue as the woman's claws, his skin taking on a waxy pallor that matched the corpses in the photographs. And as he watched in mute horror, his reflection in the glass shards surrounding him began to flicker, between his own face and the faces of countless others who had stood exactly where he now stood, their features superimposing over his own in a nightmarish slideshow of shared damnation. The woman's laughter, a sound like bones rattling in a hollow coffin, filled the room as she reached out with her two long arms, her fingers brushing against his cheeks with a perverse tenderness that made his stomach churn, her touch leaving behind trails of frostbite that spread across his skin in intricate, spiraling patterns resembling funeral lace, each icy line burning with a pain so intense it bypassed his nerves entirely and went straight to his soul. The walls had begun to undulate like living flesh, the embedded photographs pulsing like cancerous growths as their occupants pressed against the paper barriers with renewed frenzy, their skeletal hands tearing through the surface in showers of decaying cellulose, their hollow eyes fixed on Jacob with a mixture of pity and hunger, their lipless mouths forming words that carved themselves directly into his mind. Join us, become us, be us forever. The floor beneath him had turned to a quagmire of viscid black ooze that bubbled and hissed like a tar pit, pulling him downward with insistent suction, the liquid unnaturally warm against his skin, its surface reflecting not his face but an endless void where shapeless things moved just beyond sight, their forms suggesting impossible anatomies that defied all laws of nature. The woman's many heads began to merge, flesh flowing like melted wax as her features rearranged themselves into a new, even more terrible visage, a grotesque amalgamation of every person who had ever died in Room 9, their screaming mouths, forming a single, gaping maw that stretched impossibly wide, revealing a tunnel of writhing tongues and needle-like teeth that spiraled down into infinite darkness, and from that abyss came a sound that was neither scream nor song, but something far older, a vibration that resonated in Jacob's bones and made his blood turn to ice in his veins. His body was no longer his to control. His limbs moved without his command, his hands rising of their own accord to grasp at his own face, fingers digging into his eye sockets with terrifying strength as a voice that was both his and not his whispered from his own traitorous lips, "Just one more picture for the collection." The last thing Jacob saw before his fingers applied the final irrevocable pressure was the woman, now a towering monstrosity of fused corpses reaching for him with countless arms, her many mouths forming the same words in perfect, horrifying unison. "Smile for the camera." And as the darkness took him, he realized with final, awful clarity that the true horror of Room 9 wasn't the dying. It was the never being allowed to stay dead. Jacob's consciousness did not fade into blackness as he expected. Instead, it shattered into 1,000 splintered fragments, each piece tumbling through layers of reality that folded in on themselves like a funeral shroud being packed into an overstuffed coffin. His awareness expanded and contracted simultaneously, as if his mind had become trapped in some grotesque parody of a dying star collapsing in on itself, and with each passing moment, though time had lost all meaning in this liminal space between life and something far worse, he felt new horrors etching themselves into the very fabric of his being. The darkness surrounding him was not empty, but teeming with unseen entities whose forms brushed against his splintered psyche like the legs of spiders skittering across rotten floorboards, their whispers not audible, but felt as vibrations that traveled through the marrow of his bones, each word a fresh brand of madness seared into his soul. He could feel his body, or what remained of it, being pulled in countless directions at once, his flesh stretching like warm wax as countless spectral hands emerged from the void to claim pieces of him, their touch alternating between the searing heat of a crematory oven and the gelid kiss of a corpse freshly pulled from its grave. Somewhere in the swirling maelstrom of torment, the woman's laughter echoed, but it was no longer a single voice. It had become a cacophony of every scream that had ever been stifled within Room 9's cursed walls, a symphony of anguish that resonated through Jacob's very atoms. His vision, though he no longer had eyes to see, was flooded with images more terrible than anything his mortal mind could have conceived. The funeral home, stretching infinitely in all directions, its walls lined not with photographs, but with living, writhing faces trapped in eternal silent screams. The gurney at the center of it all, now a grotesque altar pulsating with malignant energy. And worst of all, his own body, or a distorted reflection of it, strapped to that gurney, his mouth sewn shut with the same black thread, his fingers twitching as they scraped uselessly against the metal surface. A new understanding dawned in what remained of Jacob's shattered mind. Room 9 was not merely a place, but a living entity that fed on the terror of its victims, growing stronger with each soul it consumed, and he had now become part of its endless hunger, his suffering, just another thread in the vast, grotesque tapestry of torment that stretched back decades. The final, most devastating revelation came as a whisper from his own stolen lips, and this was not the first time he had experienced this moment, nor would it be the last, for in Room 9, time was not linear, but a looped noose tightening around. The neck of eternity, and Jacob Riley, if he had ever truly existed at all, was now just another face on the wall, another voice in the chorus, another morsel for the darkness that would never, ever be satisfied. The moment Jacob's soul fully merged with the hungry darkness of Room 9, the very fabric of reality within those cursed walls twisted in upon itself like a dying thing attempting one final, shuddering breath. The air grew thick with the scent of embalming fluid mixed with freshly turned earth and something far more primal. The metallic tang of fear made manifest as the walls began to weep rivulets of blackened blood that pooled across the floor in intricate patterns resembling funeral rites long forgotten by mortal minds. The gurney at the center of the room, now slick with this unnatural effluence, began to tremble violently, its rusted joints screeching like the death cries of 1,000 slaughtered animals as the woman's form, now bloated and distended beyond human recognition, slowly rose into a sitting position, her spine cracking with the sound of green wood splitting in a storm, her stitched mouth straining against the threads as something vast and unspeakable moved behind her flesh, pressing outward with such force that her skin threatened to tear like rotten parchment. The photographs lining the walls had begun to melt, their images bleeding together into a swirling vortex of tormented faces that stretched and merged in impossible configurations, their screams no longer silent but erupting into the physical, whirled as tangible forces that made the few remaining light bulbs explode in showers of glass and sparks, plunging the room into a darkness so absolute it felt like being swallowed by some great beast of the abyss. Jacob, or what remained of him, could feel his consciousness being pulled apart and reassembled, his memories unraveling like a spool of thread dropped down an endless stairwell, each revolution stripping away another layer of his identity, until only the raw, screaming core of his terror remained, this precious essence being carefully harvested by the room's ancient hunger. The floorboards beneath the spreading pools of black blood had begun to warp and splinter, their nails pushing outward like claws as something vast stirred in the space between spaces below them, its movements causing the entire funeral home to shudder as if caught in an earthquake that affected only this single, cursed building. The air itself had grown heavy with static electricity that raised the hairs on Jacob's disintegrating flesh, each spark carrying with it fragments of memories that didn't belong to him. A funeral director in 1947, whispering forbidden prayers over a body that shouldn't have been moving. A grieving widow in 1961 pressing her ear to Room 9's door and hearing her recently buried husband's voice calling her name. A group of teenagers in 1989 daring each other to touch the frosted glass of Room 9's window only to watch in horror, as black veins spread up their arms from the point of contact. These stolen memories flooded Jacob's breaking mind even as his physical form began to undergo its final, terrible metamorphosis, his fingers elongating into boneless tendrils that sought the walls instinctively, fusing with the plaster like roots seeking fertile soil, his jaw unhinging with a wet pop as his mouth stretched far beyond human limits, becoming a gaping maw, perfect for swallowing the screams of future victims, his eyes melting like wax only to reform as perfect mirrors that would reflect back to each new visitor their deepest, most secret fears. As the last vestiges of his humanity slipped away, Jacob understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he wasn't merely becoming another prisoner of Room 9, he was becoming part of its consciousness, another facet of the hungry intelligence that had waited patiently behind that locked door for decades. And as the first fresh screams of a new victim echoed down the hallway outside, because there was always another victim, there would always be another victim, what had once been. Jacob Riley felt something akin to pleasure ripple through its new, monstrous form. The cycle was beginning again, and this time he would be doing the feasting. The transformation completed itself with a sound like 1,000 books slamming shut simultaneously. Jacob's flesh had become something else entirely, no longer bound by the constraints of human anatomy, but a shifting, grotesque mass of intertwined limbs and screaming mouths that pulsed in perfect sync with Room 9's dreadful heartbeat, his consciousness now stretched across every inch of the cursed space, like a spider's web glistening with fresh dew, if dew were made of the collected terror of decades of victims. The walls breathed around him, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some great beast, each exhale releasing a wave of that familiar, cloying stench, embalming fluid and damp earth, yes, but beneath it something darker, the coppery tang of blood that had never dried, the sour musk of sweat from hands that had pounded fruitlessly against the inside of caskets, the sweet rot aroma of flowers left too long on a grave. The photographs had reconstituted themselves, their glass pristine once more, and among them now hung a new addition. Jacob's own face frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide and glistening with unnatural moisture, his mouth stretched in, a silent scream that would never end. But unlike the others, his image moved, his eyes tracking the empty room with a dreadful awareness, his fingers twitching against the confines of the frame as if trying to claw his way back out. The gurney stood empty now, its surface stained with decades of fluids both human and otherwise, its wheels rusted in place from disuse, because the woman was gone, or rather, she had become Jacob, her essence merging with his in a perverse union that left him both the hunter and the hunted, the consumer and the consumed. He could feel her memories mixing with his, a flood of images more terrible than any nightmare, the suffocating darkness of a coffin buried 6 feet deep, the taste of dirt forcing its way past sewn-shut lips, the agonizing years of waiting underground, before something older than death had heard her silent screams and offered her a deal, eternal hunger in exchange for eternal existence. Now that hunger lived in Jacob, too, a gnawing, insatiable void in what passed for his soul, and as the familiar sound of hesitant footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, because there were always footsteps, the funeral home's doors locked, themselves against fleeing visitors until the ritual was complete, he felt his many mouths water in anticipation. The door creaked open, not from someone entering, but from the room itself inviting them in, the wood warping to make the knob turn on its own, the hinges screaming like a dying animal. And as the newest victim stepped across the threshold, a young woman this time, a journalist researching urban legends, her tape recorder clutched in shaking hands, Jacob felt the stitches forming over his own lips dissolve, his countless mouths opening in unison to whisper the words that would seal her fate. "Welcome to Room 9." The door slammed shut behind her. The lock clicked. Somewhere in the darkness a camera shutter clicked, and as her screams joined the chorus that would echo through eternity, Jacob finally understood the true horror of his existence. He wasn't just part of Room 9 now, he was Room 9, and he would never, ever be full.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.